Welcome back, I'm SMK. Have you ever wondered about who would be in the best starting five from every decade? Today in this video, we're going to be answering that question by picking a starting five from every decade in NBA history. Now, in this video, I picked the player based on who I would rather have on my team, and not about the individual effort. Let's get into the video. Starting off with our first decade being the 1960s. In the 1960s, there was plenty of point guards to choose from, but in my research, it came down to either Oscar Robertson or Jerry West. Now, Oscar Robertson was a very good player, but Jerry West was also an extremely good shooter. He was one of the best shooters in the league, and probably the best shooter in the league before players like Steph Curry and everybody else came in later on. But I can't go past Oscar Robertson's triple-double averaging season, which was the record that was thought to never be broken again until Russell Westbrook did it. So for that reason, my point guard will be Oscar Robertson. Coming in at the shooting guard, we have got John Havlicek. And there's not much to say about John Havlicek. There just wasn't that many other good shooting guards in this era. And now we have the most underrated NBA player in history, Elgin Baylor, coming in at the small forward. Also, the greatest loser of all time. And now this is where it gets difficult. For the two big positions, do you do Wilt Chamberlain at the power forward, or do you put Bill Russell at the power forward? And who gets the center position? I think that Bill Russell gets center and Wilt gets power, because I think that Wilt Chamberlain could definitely play the power forward position. I think that Bill Russell does not suit the power forward position, as he's not an attacking player. His game was completely based off defense, and Wilt Chamberlain could have definitely played as a power forward as well. So for that reason, Wilt goes at the 4 and Bill Russell goes at the 5, which then makes our 1960s team look a little something like this. Now, coming into the 1970s, this was probably the easiest decade to pick players from, as in my opinion, this was the lowest skilled NBA decade of all time. If you want to see a video on more of that, click up in the top right corner there. For my point guard though, I'm going to be picking Walt Frazier, the New York Knicks legend. In the shooting guard, we're going to be picking George the Iceman Gervin. Equipped with his deadly finger roll, he was one of the most deadly scorers in the 70s, and he's one of the most forgotten and underappreciated NBA legends. At the small forward, we have Pistol Pete Maravich. Pistol Pete was one of the most deadly shooters of all time. He just made it look so easy, and it didn't even look like he was playing NBA. It looked like he was just having a muck around. He was so good. These next two picks are extremely easy. Coming in at the power forward, we have Dr. Dre, aka Julius Erving. At the time, he revolutionized basketball with his flashy dunks, flashy moves, and his entirely different play style. And at the center position, we have got Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. There's almost nothing that you need to say for this pick. He's just clearly the best center from the 70s. And this is what our 70s starting five looks like.
And now we pick for the 1980s. In the 1980s, there was a lot more talent than there was in the 70s, as the Larry Bird Magic rivalry came into action. And for that reason, for my point guard, we're going to be taking Magic Johnson. Now, Magic Johnson was the first ever tall point guard, as he revolutionized the game, and now players like Ben Simmons have come and followed. In the shooting guard, we're of course going to be taking Michael Jeffrey Jordan. Now, Michael Jordan came in 1984 and already was one of the best players in the league. Coming in at the small forward position, we have the electrifying Dominique Wilkins. The dunk contest in the 80s between Michael Jordan and Dominique Wilkins was one of the best, if not the best, dunking contests of all time. These two players deserve to be on the best team from the 80s. And coming in for our power forward position, we have Larry Legend, also known as Larry Bird. Larry Bird was most well known for his shooting. He was a different power forward in his era, as he was more of a shooter and less of a rim attacker, but he could also attack the rim, and he was deadly efficient. For the center position, we've got the same center as we had in the decade before. We have Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, aka the captain. Now, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, he was better a player in the 70s, but he did not worse to that much of an effect in the 80s. He was still the best center. He still dominated in his Showtime Lakers uniform, and he was just one of the best players, probably the best player in the 80s, in my opinion. And here's what our 80s team looks like. And now we enter our next decade for the 1990s. The 90s is obviously renowned as the golden era of basketball, and for the golden era of basketball, our golden boy point guard is going to be John Stockton, the best pure point guard of all time. Now, this shouldn't be a very hard pick, because John Stockton, the leader of assists and steals, which is two stats that is critical for being a good point guard. And coming in at the shooting guard, we have the GOAT of basketball in his prime, Michael Jordan. Now, he's retained the shooting guard from the 80s into the 90s, as the 90s was his best era. In this era, he was able to win 6 championships with his Chicago Bulls and make the name for himself as the GOAT of NBA basketball. And coming in at the small forward is his teammate Scottie Pippen, who was always there in all of Jordan's highlights. He also won 6 championships with the Chicago Bulls, and Michael Jordan couldn't have done it all without Scottie.
Scottie Pippen was one of the best defenders of all time, and he's highly underrated, and he was the best number 2 that the Chicago Bulls could have ever asked for. Coming in for the power forward, we have the round mound of rebound, Charles Barkley. Now, Charles Barkley, in the name, he was an extremely good rebounder. He was tough, agile, and good for his size in those areas, but he was never able to win himself a ring, as the Michael Jordan-led Bulls or the Jazz led by the dynamic trio of John Stockton and Karl Malone would always trip him up. And coming in at the center position, we of course have Hakeem Olajuwon. Hakeem was an extremely talented center, but he also had a really good shot for a center, and that was something that the NBA hadn't really seen before he came into the league. This is what our 90s team will look like. Now we enter into the next decade, which is the 2000s. Now for the 2000s, picking the point guard was either going to be Jason Kidd or Steve Nash, but I've gone with Steve Nash. Even though Steve Nash didn't have the best athleticism in the world, he made up for it everywhere with his basketball IQ and his skillful shot making. He was also an extremely good free throw shooter, and for this reason, Steve Nash takes the place as point guard on the 2000s. Now for shooting guard, again, it seems to be the way that shooting guards are just no-brainer picks, but it's going to be Kobe Bryant. Kobe Bryant was by far one of the best players in the 2000s, and he was able to just turn a game around on its head, like as when he dropped 81 in one game. He was also able to win 4 championships in this era, which makes him way above a lot of the other players at the shooting guard in this position, and he was just one of the best players of all time. He was the reincarnation of Michael Jordan, and for this reason, he gets this spot. Coming in at the small forward, we have Vince Carter. Now, what isn't there to say about Vince Carter? He's an extremely entertaining player to watch. His dunks were fascinating for the world, and it looked like that he would be the newest face of the NBA, which that didn't really turn out for him, but he was still one of the best small forwards in the league. Now, you could argue that LeBron James should be here, and yes, I did have him there. He would be the second pick, but I just think to put it here for Vince Carter is respectable for him. And coming in for the power forward, we have the old reliable Tim Duncan. Now, when he was in the league, people didn't appreciate him as much as they probably should have, and now a lot of people have missed him and didn't watch many of his games. But if you did watch his games, you know how good of a player Tim Duncan really was. He's a top 10 best player in the NBA history, in my opinion, and he definitely deserves the spot as the best power forward in this decade. And probably, in my opinion, he's the best power forward of all time too. And coming in for the centre, another no-brainer pick, we have Shaquille O'Neal. Now, Shaquille O'Neal was one of the most dominant players in his time. He was virtually unstoppable, 300 pounds, and could move like a flick of the finger. He was incredibly quick, dominant in the paint, and no one could stop him. And this is what our 2000s team will look like. And here we are, we have arrived at our final NBA decade. This decade is a decade just gone by, and it was a very, very exciting decade that brought a lot of new talent and completely changed up how we play the game. Now, coming in for the point guard is an obvious pick. We have Steph Curry. Now, Steph Curry virtually changed the game. He changed the game from a big man-dominated game to a little man shooting threes dominated game. He's the best shooter of all time. He's the first ever unanimous MVP. He led his Warriors to the best record, an NBA record in a regular season, of all time. He is a genuine star, and he will be remembered forever, and he's definitely a top 20-plus player of all time. And coming in at the shooting guard, we've got James Harden. Now, James Harden, another player that revolutionized the game of basketball. He also brought in some rule changes, as he would draw fouls too easily by locking onto arms, but put all that aside, James Harden is still an extremely good player. His signature step-back move was incredible. He carried the Rockets through the late parts of this decade, and he was just one of the best players ever. And if he stayed at OKC with KD and Russell Westbrook, who knows what would have happened, but he's a genuine star, and he deserves this spot on the list. And for our small forward, it's another no-brainer pick. We have LeBron James. LeBron James, he could have been the small forward in the last decade as well, but I decided to give that to Vince Carter, which is a very controversial pick, but here it is. We have LeBron James. It will make you guys in the comments section happy. LeBron James definitely deserves this spot. He is just an absolute dominant player. He's definitely top 3 best players of all time, and if you don't put him there, you're just wrong. He is an absolute amazing player. He's massive. He can shoot. He can do everything. LeBron James, he can play point guard. There's nothing that this man cannot do. He deserves this spot. At the power forward, we literally have the walking cheat code, Kevin Durant. He's 7 foot. He can shoot threes. He can drive. He can dunk. There's nothing that this man cannot do. This decade really brought in some absolute talented players that have just changed the way that the game will be played forever. Now, in for the center position, we have Dwight Howard. Now, this is the one pick that could go different ways. We've had a lot of good centers coming in, but none of them have really struck us out of the park. Dwight Howard, though, is an extremely solid center. He's a really good player, and he's one of the best blocks of all time, and he's probably a top 100 player of all time. But again, there has been some other centers that have been good. Joel Embiid and a few others to name the list could have gotten on here, as the centers from this era weren't the strongest in the world, as they have become less used. And this is what our team from the final decade of the 2010s looks like. Thank you guys for watching this video. If you enjoy videos like this, make sure to subscribe. If you want to see more like this, you've got my Basketball Reach playlist up in the top right there. You can click on, you can go find another video you'd like to watch, or click one of the videos here that are most recommended for you. As always, if you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, share it with a friend, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.